In a moment, a celebration of genius continues with 2 hours devoted to one of Bach's greatest interpreters, Glenn Gould. A celebration of genius, the 300th anniversary of the birth of Johann Sebastian Bach. Hello, I'm Ken Winters. Over the next 2 hours, we'll be privy to a highly idiosyncratic examination of the life, times, and music of Bach by one of his foremost interpreters, the late Glenn Gould. When Gould died so tragically young in 1982, it was a loss not only for music, but also for the world of ideas. Like his performances of Bach's keyboard works, Gould's thoughts on the composer and the Baroque could at times be equally eccentric and equally illuminating. For a world-renowned pianist, Glenn Gould's repertoire was surprisingly limited. It was confined largely to a small handful of composers, though giants all of them: Mozart, Beethoven, Richard Strauss, Schoenberg, and of course Bach. And while one has the feeling that Gould respected all these musical masters enormously, in Bach, one senses that Gould detected a kindred spirit. His individualistic performances of Bach's music seemed at times not so much interpretations as quasi-collaborations, piano playing for 4 hands and obligato humming. Glenn Gould's comments on Bach and his works have been selected from a number of radio and television programs, which Gould either appeared on or produced himself. He can be heard solo, and in conversation with composer and critic Curtis Davis, former CBC music producer James Kent, University of Toronto German Department head Professor Hans Eichner, BBC music critic Humphrey Burton, and John McClure, head of the classical music division of CBS Records. These excerpts span nearly 2 decades, and if the quality of the sound sometimes leaves much to be desired, the soundness of the insight should provide more than ample compensation. Glenn Gould could have chosen any number of careers. His scholastic records show he could have been a creditable scientist or mathematician. He could have been, in fact he was, a first-rate writer and broadcaster, and he might have made a fascinating and provocative university professor. Fortunately for lovers of music, Glenn Gould concentrated his enormous talents on that discipline. And fortunately for admirers of Glenn Gould, his interest in recording has preserved for future generations his performances of Bach and other composers, as well as his personal opinions of that music. Here then are the notes, both verbal and manual, of Glenn Gould, the well-tempered polymath.
I wanted to be involved in music. I don't think I particularly cared whether it involved being a concert pianist. I don't think that for a long time I had a very clear idea of what being a concert pianist meant. I don't think many of us do ever, you know. And if we did, we never would become one. I didn't really constitute the case of a child prodigy in any sense, really. I made my debut when I was about 14, which was pretty late in life, as those things go, you know. As a matter of fact, I truthfully played in public on the organ before I played on the piano. And this was kind of a funny thing, because the organ is supposed to be a tremendously complicated and formidable instrument with all kinds of keyboards here and more keyboards down here. And yet, it seemed to me one of the greatest senses of satisfaction to play particularly old music, Bach and Handel and music before that, in fact, music of 200 or 300 years ago on the organ. And through playing the organ, I think that to this day, it's that music of Bach and of Handel and so on, that is perhaps the closest music to me.
What are the earliest recollections that you have of hearing the music of Bach?
My own performances, I'm not sure. No, I wasn't all that precocious. It's simply that I wasn't much attracted to multi-voiced things until I was a teenager. I was definitely homophonically inclined until the age of about 10. And then I suddenly got the message. And Bach began to emerge into my world and has never altogether left it. Of course, one of the great moments of my life, and it was not with a Bach fugue, but it was with a fugue, and its relevance is entirely fugal, was when I was exposed to my own performance of the Mozart Fugue Koelschel 394, the C major one, the which is a wonderful academic study in how to write a fugue and obey the textbook and never quite get it off the ground, but I do like it. And I was learning it. I was early teenager, I don't remember exactly how old. And suddenly a vacuum cleaner was struck up beside the piano, and I couldn't quite hear myself play. I was having a feud with the housekeeper at this particular time, and it was done on purpose. But I couldn't quite hear myself. I began to feel what I was doing, the whole tactile presence of that fugue as was represented by finger positions, and is represented also by the kind of sound that you might get if you stood in the bathtub and in a shower and shook your head, you know, with water coming out of both ears. And it was the most luminously exciting thing you can imagine, the most glorious sound. It took off all of the things Mozart didn't quite manage to do, I was doing for him, and I suddenly realized that that particular screen through which I was viewing this and which I had erected between myself and Mozart and his fugue was exactly what I needed to do, and exactly why, as I later understood, a certain mechanical process could indeed come between, you know, myself and the work of art that I was involved with. One of the most extraordinary things about history's most extraordinary musician is the fact that this man's music, which exerts such a magnetic attraction for us today and against which we tend to measure much of the achievement in the art of music in the last 2 centuries, that this music had absolutely no effect
on either the musicians or the public of his own day. And the strange thing about Bach is that he doesn't at all fit our conception of the misunderstood genius who was years ahead of his time. He was certainly misunderstood, but not because he was ahead of his time, rather because according to the musical disposition of that day, he was generations behind it. And Bach, as he grew older, not only made no attempt to reconcile his thought with the temper of his times, but in fact withdrew into what must have seemed to his contemporaries surely as a maddening nostalgia for the glories of ages past. For Bach, you see, was music's greatest nonconformist, and one of the supreme examples of that independence of the artistic conscience that stands quite outside the collective historical process. The age of Bach, speaking in a very general sort of way, was what we can now call the age of reason, or perhaps an age of reason. There have really been quite a lot of them. It was fundamentally an age in which man struggled against fear, against predeterminacy. It was an age in which he asserted confidently the wonders of science and of human initiative. It was at times an age of hubris, of defiance for the gods. But at its most poetic, it was still an age in which the wonderful utilities of science and the proud genius of man could coexist with the magical, mystical, fearful rites of belief. And so the art and the poetry and the music of the Baroque, at its best, is touched with this feeling of compromise, this conciliation between the will of man and the inexorable power of fate. But even during the lifetime of Sebastian Bach, this vibrant spiritual compromise, which gave such anguish and purpose and passion to his music, became for other artists of his generation ever more difficult to achieve. And slowly but surely, fact and logic, the explainable and the predictable, became the basis of philosophic premise. And by the time of his death, the world was a very different place from that into which he had been born. It was a world which longed to be logical, a world for young men and for young ideas. When Bach died, it was not he, but rather his sons who were considered to be the masters of music, masters of a music so very different from that which their father had known. It was they and composers like the teenager Joseph Haydn who were soon to lay the groundwork for a new musical style in which all of this scientific optimism, all of this naively logical philosophic thought of their generation would find a counterpart in an art in which the aim would be not the communication of man with God, but rather of man with man, in which those traits of Sebastian Bach which parallel in music the realization of the incredible richness and indefinable complexity of the human estate could find no place. It had become an age in which the focus of musical activity had moved from the church to the theater, in which the new art would rationally reflect a rational world, in which it would be required to deal with probabilities and not to participate in mysteries. And for a new age, new musical forms, the symphony and the sonata were the instrumental forms which this aggressive new humanity built to express itself. These were forms which were based primarily upon the simplification and the clarification of the system of what we call tonal harmony. And to these forms came a whole new conception of the role of the musical theme. They used the theme not as something which just was, which permeated every facet of a work as it did in Bach's music, but as something unique, something singularly eventful, something belonging to the moment. This was also the age in which the concepts of a clear, symmetrical musical architecture became paramount. For Bach's sons, the theme was essentially an isolated event, related, propelled into a relationship, really, with other themes, other isolated events, by the device of what is called harmonic modulation, by the family ties of one key to another. And these family relationships were the background against which this new musical architecture built its structures. Now, Bach, unlike his sons, wasn't really searching for concise harmonic definition for the joining relationship of themes. His harmony, his sense of architecture was immensely complex, infinitely richer than that of his sons, really, and fraught with the kind of adventures that hadn't existed in the musical language since Gesualdo in the 16th century, and which didn't exist again until Schoenberg in the 20th. And while his son's music, with its symmetrical pleasure, its measured form, seems to relate somehow to the probabilities of a rational artistic creed, Bach's music, with all its eternally undulating flow of harmonic motion, with all its vast linear complication, seems to suggest somehow the suspended, perpetually transient, unknowing condition of man. One doesn't come to expect great surprises in the music of Bach. One comes across great moments, indescribable technical achievements, but one is not led to expect, in the course of a work, any moment, any pronouncement in which the whole work is not involved. In Bach's music, it's the constancy of event, the continuous line of development, the certainty of motion which we come to expect and to love. Essentially for Bach, art was a means of expressing that state of belief in which experience could be natively guided, in which only the obstructions and temptations of the world could thwart the immutable totality of existence, in which, however, the necessity to fend against these temptations provoked the drama of human life. It is these temptations and the constant effort which is required to expel them with which the text of the cantata number 54 is concerned. The title of this cantata, which Russell Oberlin is going to sing with us in a moment or two, Widerstehe doch der Sünde, roughly translates as stand firm against sin or something like that, and is very probably by Bach himself. Certainly its musical realization is given an intensely urgent and poignant expression. Its very opening chord is one of the most striking in all of Bach's harmonic arsenal. In fact, coming as it does at the beginning of a work, it's just about unprecedented. And both of the outer movements of this cantata are full of that wonderful and tortuous art of intense cross-relation and suspension, which Bach always reserved for those subjects on which he felt most keenly, most deeply.
If, in Glenn Gould's view, Bach was the keeper of the flame, so to speak, of traditional tonality, Bach's use of keys and their relationships to one another prompted Gould and former CBC music producer James Kent to engage in an impromptu musical and intellectual parlor game, one which might well be called Forgive Us Our Digressions.
The current trend in fan mags out Hollywood way is to include the sort of interview where the interviewee, be they star or starlet, are subjected to a certain series of identification, association quiz tests, such as Natalie Wood, if you were a platypus, what sort of platypus would that be, Natalie Wood? You know, I played this game once over dinner with some friends, and there was a lady present whom I'd not met before, and I thought I'd sized her up rather well, and so toward the end of dinner we began playing this game, and she seemed, fairly direct, honest, straightforward, outgoing, well brought up, and so I said, "You're a C major person." And I tell you, there was sufficient umbrage taken to leave me stocked with it for many years. It was incredible. She thought that she was an F-sharp major person. Of course, you can't be much farther from C major than that. She thought she was introverted, inner-directed, troubled, ambivalent, none of the things that a C major would suggest. And it really brought home to me that these funny old associations that composers had, that Scriabin had, and perhaps even Chopin had with key and key signature, do mean something. I don't know quite what they mean, and I'm not a believer in it, but I'm sufficiently open to ask you what it does mean.
Or what key do you associate yourself with, Glenn?
I think I'm F minor, or perhaps B minor, one of the two. The key of B minor, for instance, played a role for Bach. I don't quite know how great a role because I haven't any statistics handy, but Bach does represent the democratization of the key and the key signature. Whatever a composer did, he self-consciously wrote in every key to prove as an instrumental feat that it could be done, and there was no reason with improved technology why it shouldn't be done. Yet B minor is the key of the Mass. It's the key of Es ist genug from the St. John Passion. I think it's the key of O Sacred Head Now Wounded from the St. Matthew, and of many other statements which seem to wrap up his Christ love, C minor, similarly, for Beethoven, E flat major for Richard Strauss, the Eroica key, the Heldenleben key, God help us all, the Enoch Arden key. There does seem to be this peculiar sense of affinity for a certain mood establishing itself in a certain key. I mean, for instance, it always occurred to me that if this democratization of the Bach key system is what it's cracked up to be, then technically one should be able to take any movement from any suite, transpose it to any other key in which another suite has been written, and have it fit without its seams showing. But I wonder if that's really so. I mean, can you take this and turn it into C minor and make this out of it? Did you find any difference in that?
Yes, it doesn't seem to be nearly as brilliant.
In the C minor?
In C minor.
Really? Despite the fact that it's higher?
Despite the fact. It seems a little gloomier to me, really, than B minor. B minor seems to me happier, more incisive, more aggressive, more outgoing key than C minor.
Much of what we derive from key relates to what you could call certain primary experiences of keys as contained in national anthems, in hymns, in folk songs, in the primary listening experiences, if you can call them that. So I went through Groves the other day, and I'm happy to tell you that there are only 2 national anthems in the world which contain more than 3 flats or 3 sharps in their signature, those of Belarus and Lithuania. And think in terms of what that basic presupposition as to the texture of a key could do for Slavic gloom, as, betrayed through the, the Belarusian tone poems, which we're all so familiar. Name one, please. But, if you think in terms of the fact that most people are familiar with national anthems that are in C major, or as in our case in G major, or F major for the O Canada, it does somehow suggest to me that will
grow on all of us as a primary reference. That will be something incredibly open, commonplace, and everyday and direct. And that as you proceed through the cycle of fifths, as you move from G major to D major to A major to E major, or conversely from C to F to B flat, you move away from that primary experience, and perhaps in the secondary, in the tertiary experience, there is a notion that somehow embedded in that experience is something anti-folk, something composer-directed, something infinitely tactily involved, and that maybe that's why people like Scriabin and Chopin, who had very strong tactile senses, who were great instrumentalists as well as great composers, wanted to write in F-sharp major and an A-flat major, all those, sort of dirty old man sexy keys. I don't know, but that's the closest I can come to suggesting that maybe it is a basic source of reference to what's being listened to in our society. If we think in terms of B minor, we are thinking of two things, perhaps. I don't know. Again, this whole area is new to me, and I think we're proceeding in a most gloriously unscientific way about it all. But it's due, first of all, to a conditioning of B minor per se, which is a 2-sharp key, a relationship of D major. It is also due to a conditioning of the fundamental note B, which, in terms of our English national anthem reference, is a pretty sexy key, B major. Now, if you put this together, you get in B minor a kind of, what can I say, lofty directness. You get a confluence of two capabilities. One, the capability to be relatively fundamental and basic and world-concerned, as in D major, which is a simple 2-sharp key. The other, a much more complicated tendency to introduce accidentals, to introduce enharmonic elements within the national experience. You put those two together, and you get a sort of lofty, professorial, but national collective concern. Maybe that's why B minor is the key of the B minor mass, is the key of SSK, is the key of, sort of worldview statements, for Bach at any rate.
Yes,
I don't know that it was for Brahms, but I speculate that it could be as much an allegiance to principal tone phenomena as it could to the basic key signature itself. In which case, it's the suggestion of modality, of pre-tonal memory. I mean, it's a Jungian thing, I suppose, really, in that case.
Bach's music provides us with the grand summation of all the techniques practiced by the great masters of North European music since the early Renaissance. He stands at the very end of a long line of German and Dutch and Flemish masters who tried to create harmonic vitality out of what must surely at one time have seemed the shrunken limits of major-minor tonality, which began in the early 17th century. Bach's harmonic thinking belongs to that concept of the tonal universe in which all of the anxious transition of musical history had been involved a century or two before his birth, in which this new system of tonality first proved victorious over the complex relations of modal harmony. Certainly all of the elaborate melodic techniques which Bach used were essentially those which had been developed and in some cases perfected by the great masters of the late Renaissance. In fact, Bach's linear devices, his vast resources of fugue and canon, were essentially techniques that required the widest possible harmonic references, techniques which would necessarily find the stringent economy of 18th century tonality a challenging but infuriating discipline. And one of the qualities which gives Bach's work its extraordinary poignancy is the fact that we can practically see him struggling to restrain the limits of his incredible linear imagination in order to fit and even to save the disciplining harmonic progressions of tonality. For Bach, as a German, stands between the two rival tendencies of early Baroque music, that of the north of the Dutch and Flemish tradition, in which the contrapuntal styles, the melodic developments of her work, were essentially based upon vocal prerequisites, and that of the south of Italy, in which the florid diversions of instrumental style were allowed to create their own sources of technique. Bach somehow managed to coordinate both approaches to the art of music. We find him, in his earlier years, writing fugues that had subjects like this one. Subjects which would be quite impossible to attempt to sing. But on the other hand, here's a fugue which Bach wrote the very year of his death, 1750. And in it, we can see that not only the harmonic style is infinitely more complex, but also that it would be possible to sing. This is music conceived in linear, in vocal terms. In fact, all of the tendencies which were rapidly crystallizing in the musical art of Bach's time were the exact opposite of that which is represented by that example and by this one, this glorious example from the art of the fugue. By no means all of Bach's writing is as intense or as arduous as the art of the fugue. When he adopts the instrumental principles of the Italian concerto style, he brings to them a certain stability, certain Germanness. They become in his hands as vital and as purposeful as that heartiest of the offshoots of the Reformation, the German chorale. sounds just vaguely familiar. That is not really a chorale I played. In fact, that, reduced to its harmonic basis, is the opening of the first theme of the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto. It's rather remarkable, I think, that even here, in this most sophisticated, most Italianate of the forms of Bach's day, the concerto, we find in the structural pillars of his writing that same harmonic purity and clarity of thinking which marks the great sources of German chorale writing. By the way, this little gadget on which I just played that fugue is, in case you're wondering, not exactly a piano and not exactly a harpsichord. It's a neurotic piano that thinks it's a harpsichord, and I'm going to close it now because it's also too noisy. That same theme, by the way, of the Brandenburg shows clearly, I think, the great differences in harmonic thinking that existed between Bach and his more progressive colleagues. The theme wanders constantly back and forth across the key center axis of D major, which is the key of the work. And each time we feel a conclusion coming on, something else happens to delay it. This is the sort of harmonic plan that Bach's sons wouldn't have been caught dead adopting. For them, the satisfaction of the musical structure was in getting through to the end, in termination, in achieving finality. For Bach, it wasn't finality that mattered in music, not really. It was simply the joyous essence of being.
Mention has already been made of some of the non-German elements in Bach's musical offerings, chiefly the northern Flemish and southern Italian models, which Bach adopted, incorporated, and inevitably transcended. Another foreign influence made itself felt as well as heard in Bach's compositions, the French style, characterized by numerous dance tunes then popular, some would even say rampant, at the hyper-cultivated court of the Sun King, Louis XIV. Why in so many of Bach's works, lours, gavottes, courantes, allemands, and gigs should constitute so much of the musical vocabulary of a man who never traveled beyond the borders of his native land, obviously intrigued Glenn Gould. His curiosity was set to rest, in part at least, by examining the broad spectrum of France's cultural influence on that loose confederation of states, duchies, and principalities we know as Germany, in conversation with Professor Hans Eichner, head of the German department at the University of Toronto.
Professor Eichner, what would a reasonably well-educated, reasonably articulate, and very staunch burgher like Johann Sebastian Bach know about the world beyond his particular city?
He would certainly know a fair amount about France. The French influence was very strong at that time, particularly at the small courts where Bach spent a good deal of his life. As you know, Germany wasn't really a nation-state at that time. It consisted of hundreds of small principalities, and every petty duke or petty count wanted to have his own mini Versailles. This would involve a French cook and French clothes, and as far as Bach is concerned, of course, it would involve imported French musicians whom we would talk to.
Well, there are all sorts of intriguing moments in his letters in which justements and ineffects and so on, creep into what must otherwise have been fairly stolid prose, or reads like it anyway.
Well, the fact that every petty duke and petty count wanted to have his mini Versailles, I think, had an extremely important influence on the development of music. People always wonder why music flourished just in Germany, just at this particular time. And I think one reason is quite simply that having an orchestra and putting on operas was part of the process of conspicuous consumption.
So there was a Veblen-esque motif at work even then. Yes. That's very interesting.
I'm quite sure if the dukes and bishops and counts had been as interested as the English landed aristocracy in good horses and good hounds, Germany would have produced the most marvelous racehorses, but Haydn might have become a goldsmith.
It's always struck me that French music, particularly, I'm not competent to talk about French furniture or French literature even, but French music was a very odd model for anyone to take, and I'm not wholly convinced, in fact, that any major German composer did take French music as a model. I think they took the practices of the French musical establishment rather than French music itself, because French music that was more or less contemporary with Bach was incredibly arbitrary stuff. I mean, it would be like trying to export Shostakovich to Tanganyika or Karl Orff to New Orleans or something. It's just something that is totally opposed to the whole harmonic fluidity, which, as I take it, was really the basis of post-Lutheran German music. I mean, French music was terribly static at that time, and proud of its staticity. How do you say that? Proud of its static quality. It had a sort of 4-5-1, and occasionally not quite, but almost that relentlessness that hasn't been touched by anyone until the Beatles came along and did much the same thing and for much the same arbitrary and wrong-headed purposes, it seems to me. Would a person like Bach have conditioned his enthusiasm for things French, or for things Italian for that matter, with a notion of what it meant spiritually to be a German?
Hardly at all. By and large, a German didn't really have a fatherland, and to someone who wasn't a nobleman, who wasn't at least a large landowner, it really made no difference who the petty prince was who determined your life. If the duke or count or bishop took a real interest in his people, there might be close personal ties, but nothing in terms of modern nationalism. Nothing that I would really care to call political. He would be very intensely aware of his Protestantism. Anti-Catholicism was a fashion in central and northern Germany, but there again a great deal of the German anti-Catholicism was actually imported from France.
How does an attitude of that kind manifest itself in the literature of the time? Like most Canadians, I'm blissfully ignorant about German literature. How does it show up and in what forms?
What you notice immediately is that at least until the late 30s, the literature is imitative of French examples. And German literature doesn't really come into its own till quite a bit later, the late 60s, the 70s. But there was a religious countercurrent, and that was that as a reaction to the prevailing rationalism, the prevailing Enlightenment atmosphere, pietism had developed, which was inner-directed, which drew on German rather than French models. And Bach, of course, knew this literature extremely well. He used pietist poetry over and over again for cantatas. It's terrible poetry. It is really quite appalling. The kind of poetry that now strikes us, not only as sentimental, but as slightly hysterical. But then it happens so very rarely that great music is written on the basis of good poetry.
Yes, sort of a 1 centuries early and poetic version of Pre-Raphaelite painting or something of the sort. That's fascinating.
If Glenn Gould revered Johann Sebastian Bach above all other composers, his reverence fell far short of out-and-out idolatry. In Gould's admittedly prejudiced opinion, even Bach could display musical feat of purest kaolin, especially when he left off working and reworking a piece until it was both musically euphoric and intellectually impeccable, and turned to keyboard improvisations, an exercise Gould ranked on a level with that of a bored business executive doodling on a desk blotter. Gould no more believed that great music could be composed extempore than modern science believes in animal reproduction by means of spontaneous generation, and for the same reason, it provides a comfortable refuge from rationality. The great heroes of antiquity had no more implacable a nemesis than Bach had in Glenn Gould, nor one nearly so deft, witty, or so maddeningly amiable in delivering a verbal slap on the unreflective wrist.
Music has the frustrating habit of proving in the end to have been about nothing in particular. It allows a great latitude for indulgence to its author and to its listener, and we sometimes are tempted to objectify the musical experience in a manner that would never occur to us when dealing, for instance, with the written word. For if by comparison we find in the daily paper a story defaced by typographical errors, blurred by ink splotches, and distorted by makeup editors' cuts, we can still manage to piece together a reasonably comprehensive account of the item concerned simply by making connections which our experience with language and with human motivation conveys to us as reasonable. We know that, given time, the reporter and his editor would have hoped to make it a coherent account, and it doesn't upset us unduly if we must allow that their deadline was hard upon them before this could come to pass. It's even possible for us to derive a certain amusement from paragraphs where the syntax is as elusive as used to be the case in the press conferences of, now let me say this, Dwight Eisenhower. And the reason is simple enough. Like those Sunday painters who confess to not knowing much about art, but to knowing nonetheless what they like, so it is with the written word. We all improvise with it continuously. We're all of us on terms with the artist, which, if you think about it, was Nikita Khrushchev's problem in a nutshell. But it's not easy for the layman to enjoy that camaraderie with the musical profession. For ever since the Renaissance, the explosion of instrumental styles in music has obliterated for all practical purposes whatever chant forms and folk modalities once served to cement a relationship between audience and artist. And consequently, the laity have long been convinced that the making of music is a game regulated by such arcane devices that they couldn't be expected to understand in any event. What they do expect is that the composer must know the score, as a plumber knows sewage systems, must know it not as an intuitive experience, but as a thoroughly reasoned argument, even if the probes and cavils of that argument are not apparent to them, and that whatever extemporaneous elements are involved must be subjected to the laws of musical rhetoric. It's an attitude that bears special watching today because this is the age of the debatable motive of concern with whether and to what degree our thoughts and our works derive from a conscious industry or result from concealed and unacknowledged desires. So the relationship between an organized and a spontaneous structure depends, first of all, on those preconceptions which we bring to our analysis of them. An improvisation is not necessarily a work which gets by with a minimum of formal coherence. There are such works, and we'll discuss some of them later, but the more intriguing aspect of improvisation is the way in which it derives from and relates to the disciplines of a notated context. After all, the primary difference between music made up on the spur of the moment and music carefully and conscientiously written down is not in the nature of the materials used, but rather that under the duress of the improvisatory situation, a musician can't possibly be as thoughtful and as perceptive about the choice and disposition of his material. For when improvising, or even when dealing with hastily written down pieces, one simply has no time to exercise with patience and through many drafts carefully worked out contrapuntal inventions. No one has ever been able to do that, not even J.S. Bach. In the Musical Offering, his massive treatise on a theme supplied him by Frederick the Great, Bach opens the work with a three-voice fugue, or ricercare as he calls it on this occasion, apparently similar in manner to one which he improvised at Frederick's court and in the king's presence, and with which he acknowledged his dissatisfaction by later dedicating higher work as an apologia. Here it is in its second written-down version, and as though Bach were more interested in recapturing the mood of that courtly occasion rather than in salvaging his reputation for contrapuntal extravaganzas, it's still rather disjointed and episodic, still lacking a firm sense of direction, still fundamentally improvisatory in design. Having put his theme through many canons and a four-movement sonata, Bach, at the end of the work, tries it again as a fugue subject, and this time creates a monumental six-voice setting in which the security and tautness of the counterpoint are miraculous, and which not even he could have improvised. If the improvised fugue can never compete as a technical achievement with the carefully contoured written one, it's not because it lacks academic pretension. The contrapuntal devices may not entirely succeed, but an improvisation drawn upon any academic model will inevitably, even ostentatiously, mimic the criteria of its notated cousin. And there are many such criteria. Here's just one of them.
bet you when he wrote this one, he was thinking of something else.
Victor Borge, improvising his way through one inescapable cliché of Baroque style, the "this could go on forever and probably will" diatonic sequence. Sequences like that, which are identical repetitions of a phrase with only the pitch altered, are able to circumnavigate the chief relations of the home tonality almost indefinitely. They're among the most useful crutches for the improviser whose inspiration is temporarily curtailed. They serve him much as an automatic pilot serves an aviator. They won't get you down to the field or up over the weather, but they will at least keep you going until you can think of something to do. Borge's sequence was a very broad spoof of a sequential tradition which appears again and again in Baroque music, even in highly organized forms like the fugue. And it wasn't only minor masters of the Baroque who made use of such episodes. Even Bach, in his early years, often did, and the presence of such sequences in many of his instrumental fugues reminds us of the high improvisatory quotient in his first style. Bach, after all, was an indefatigable improviser, and here in the fugue from his E minor toccata, it shows. These devices are, of course, in themselves anti-architectural, because nothing about them is either problematical or central to the work. They may indeed perpetuate a fragment from one of the primary motivic strands of the piece, but they don't clarify it or increase our knowledge of it. They're devised primarily to kill time. In most quasi-improvised music, the melodic materials are chosen to minimize mechanical problems rather than to impose new and unpredictable intervallic situations. Hence, scale passages, arpeggiated figures, and a generous supply of ornaments are the improviser's melodic stock in trade. Materials of this sort predominated improvisatory formats, whether the extemporaneous flights of jazzmen, the showtime amalgams of cocktail pianists, the cadenza tradition in concerto playing, or a few years back, those coy fantasias on themes submitted by the bald-headed gentleman in the third row aisle, or the lady with the feather in the gallery with which Alec Templeton or Grace Castagnetta finished off their act. It's this rather lackadaisical approach to problems of structure which prompts the familiar caricature of the improvisatory tradition. It's undoubtedly the inspiration for those pre-Raphaelite paintings which show us a heaven-storming virtuoso agonizing before his instrument in a twilit bric-a-brac-filled garret, the reproductions of which turn up nowadays on Austrian cookie tins or as cosmetic ads in the New Yorker magazine. But this melodic thrashing about is by no means exclusively a 19th century tradition. In Bach's day, we find that kind of improvising in the recitative, especially in the instrumental recitative, which he was fond of incorporating into many of his early compositions. This sort of improvising is essentially a performer's rather than a composer's prerogative. It relies upon the invention of agreeable melodies, rich but not really complicated textures, and a heavy overlay of sentimentality, the latter designed so as to conceal by dramatic initiatives the lack of carefully worked out developmental ideas. I suspect that the therapeutic aspect of improvisation has in fact served many earlier composers as well. Within every creative person there is an inventor at odds with a museum curator. And most of the startling things that happen in music are the result of some momentary gain by one at the expense of the other. The free-form extension which improvisation implicitly commends supplements and lends perspective to the controlled compositional experience which underlies musical theory. It brings one back to an encounter with certain primeval tenets of the idea of music. It reminds one that the will to communicate is antecedent to the urge to formulate communication, that for the composer, even as for the listener, there are limits to immediate comprehension, to a complete understanding of the why of his process, and that very deficiency augurs a certain tolerance in their relationship. Above all, it suggests to us the importance of distinguishing between sentiments inspired by genuine reaction and impression, and those aroused by the need to react and to feel impressed. And in offering that remarkably humbling experience to the jaded sophisticate, improvisation performs perhaps its most important function.
Glenn Gould's international career took off in 1955. Appropriately enough, it was the music of Bach that helped propel him to instant superstardom, the technically daunting Goldberg variations. That was in 1955. 9 years later, Gould had all but given up live concert appearances. The reason was not so much that Gould enjoyed concertizing less, he'd never liked it, in fact, but that he valued perfection more. Luckily, the medium he now took up, recording, was entering on the dawn of a technological revolution, one which Glenn Gould took full advantage of. Now he could make music sound the way it did inside his mind's ear, rather than relying on swarms of spectators and adrenaline-influenced inspiration.
In January 1950, I took part for the first time in a CBC broadcast and made a discovery that influenced in a rather profound way my development as a musician. I discovered that in the privacy, the solitude, and if all Freudians will stand clear, the womb-like security of the studio, it was possible to make music in a more direct, more personal manner than any concert hall would ever permit. I fell in love with broadcasting that day, and I've not since been able to think of the potential of music, or for that matter of my own potential as a musician, without some reference to the limitless possibilities of the broadcasting and recording medium. For me, the microphone has never been that hostile, clinical, inspiration-sapping analyst some critics, fearing it, complain about. That day in 1950, it became and has remained a friend. In fact, most of the ideas that occur to me as a performer relate in some measure to the microphone. Now, I know this sounds like a minute observation capriciously expanded into an imposing theory, but it isn't. The microphone does encourage you to develop attitudes to performance which are entirely out of place in the diffuse acoustic of the concert hall. It permits you to cultivate a degree of textural clarity which simply doesn't pay dividends in the concert hall. This sort of clarity. That was the third fugue from Bach's Kunstfuge, the Art of the Fugue, and it was recorded at the organ of All Saints Kingsway Anglican Church in Toronto. What I like about that recording is that because of the gloriously eccentric registration which that Casavant instrument offered, the contrapuntal strands of the music are each allowed to have a life of their own. They're not embalmed in reverberation as organ recitals in many churches tend to be. We were, of course, very fortunate in being able to record in a church which possessed a remarkably light reverberation. But that recording goes even further. The microphones were placed hard up against the organ chest so that the pipes could speak, as they say, and perhaps even wheeze occasionally as well. There was no attempt to glamorize the sound, to surround it with a halo of resonance, or to mic it so distantly as to suggest that one was listening to it from far back in the congregation. There was, in fact, no attempt to capitalize on a sense of occasion, on relating our performance of the Art of the Fugue to that church on that winter afternoon, and hence to create for the listener an artificial sense of participation in the occasion of performance. Our aim was to ignore the occasion of recording and to concentrate instead upon the likely circumstance of playback, to think about the living rooms, studios, automobiles, transistors on a sand dune, in which or through which that recording might conceivably be heard. When you do ponder these circumstances, it's a uniquely humbling experience because you realize that the mood and atmosphere in which the playback transmission is received can never be exactly the same on any two occasions, and that consequently it doesn't make sense to involve the listener in atmospheric situations, to make them relate to a particular moment in time and to share the occasion with the performer. In the last few years, there have been a great spate of recordings which have attempted to do just this, the so-called live recitals, transcribed complete with a reverent hush as Maestro makes his entrance, guitaral distress from the third row in the gallery, and a pickup so discreet the microphone seems wedged into the spotlight control. But I don't believe that that is what recording is all about. I don't think that the concert is any longer the focal point of musical activity. It may well be a touching and sentimental gesture to preserve it in memory, but it also seems to me innocent of any musical justification.
The concert hall, as we know it,
is dead. It's dead.
Well, the Festival Hall's doing quite good business in London. The New York Philharmonic Hall is doing quite good business.
Well, I don't know whether you're a gambling man, but don't put your money on it that it will still be doing good business in the year 1999.
You mean the people won't want to go and listen to a Tchaikovsky concert even, or...?
I'll be very disappointed in the audience that I think is growing up now if they do want to go and listen to a Tchaikovsky concert. I say this with nothing against Tchaikovsky. I say it only with the idea of Tchaikovsky concerts would, to me, be an absurdity in 1999.
You'll have to develop this straight away.
The slightly bemused gentleman just being informed of the concert hall's demise is BBC critic and commentator Humphrey Burton. In 1966, he and Glenn Gould engaged in a television debate on the future of live concerts. Gould, who'd given up performing in public just 2 years earlier, obviously relished his role as the not-so-angry young iconoclast. The program aroused almost as much controversy as Gould's more eccentric excursions at the keyboard. Not surprisingly, the program was repeated several times. Once again, apologies are in order for the murky sound. All I can say is, please don't adjust your sets. The trouble is permanent.
It is not, in my judgment, possible to find in any concert hall today, no matter how well engineered that hall may be, and very few built today are well engineered, as you very well know, it is not possible to hear a performance of a Beethoven symphony as splendidly executed as you can hear it on a recording, and you can take that phrase splendidly executed to mean anything you want. First of all, it's not possible to hear it as well played. It cannot be done, because at some point, no matter how energized that performance may be, no matter what special festive occasion may have given rise to it, the horn is going to miss a note, there is going to be a string tutti that's not quite together. And this may have nothing to do with a lack of rehearsal time, although it may well have to do with just that. But it isn't possible to look for that kind of perfectionism in performance that you will find on any decent recording that you buy. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's not possible, no matter where you sit in that hall, whether you sit in the loges or in the orchestra or in the gods, it's not possible to hear that performance with the kind of clarity and the dissection of the instrumental involvement that you can hear it in your home speaker. After all, a great deal of music that I, as a performer, would play if I, in fact, gave concerts, which thank God I no longer do, would be music not written for an auditorium seating 2,000 or 3,000 people. It would be the music of Bach, it would be the music of Mozart, it would be the music of Beethoven, written for palaces, written for churches, written for homes. And why on earth should I try to play this in an auditorium that seats 2,000 or 3,000 people? And if so, is it not likely that I will accommodate some part of my interpreter's purpose to the fact that it does seat 2,000 or 3,000 people? It becomes, in fact, a perversion of the music in order to do this.
You have to over-dramatize it.
Indeed, and I can give you an extremely good example of that, Humphrey, because in 1957, I went to Europe for the first time and played a number of concerts in the Soviet Union. And one of the pieces that I played on every second concert, more or less, and on those concerts in which I didn't play it, I used it, or part of it, as an encore, was the Fifth Partita of Bach, which is a piece I happen to love very much. And that very same year, I recorded it for the first and only time, and I happened to make that recording 1 week after coming back from the Soviet tour. And I think if I could buy up every extant copy of that recording and call them all in and reissue it afresh without jeopardizing my royalties, I would do so very willingly. It's a dreadful recording. And the reason for it isn't that it was bad as piano playing or anything of that kind. Probably it was more pianistically contrived than any of the other Bach recordings I'd ever done, but for that very reason, it's bad. It's not Bach, it's piano playing.
Can you demonstrate this?
Yes. I played it rather as though one were to look at the score and say, well, now, how am I going to project this to that guy up there, 60 feet away in the third balcony sort of thing? Well, obviously, one way you're going to project it is the way pianists traditionally have projected Bach in concert. Lots of crescendos, lots of diminuendos, minor fluctuations of tempo that Bach never thought of, didn't want, and that were no part of Bach's language or understanding of music. So let me give you but one example, the Allemande from this partita. Now, this is the way, as I recall, I played it back in 1957, on recording, if you could believe it. Like a dose of smelling salts now, or later.
A dose of smelling salts?
Yes, I mean, it's disgraceful, One has to be revived after hearing Bach played like that. On the other hand...
Play it how you think it should be.
How I think it should be. Well, it's obvious.
not a piece about which one can have doubts, because what I sacrificed in version number 1, in the recorded version, was the spine of the music. The whole backbone was gone. And it was gone precisely because I knew perfectly well, as a traveling pro, so to speak, that if, in fact, I kept that backbone, it would sound a little tedious in a concert hall, because that great, vast thing that needs to be absorbed out there was going to it wasn't going to project the clarity that I wanted people to live off, you know.
It seems to me that your criticism against concert halls is true probably for what you play. It doesn't seem to me to be universally valid for music which was designed for concert halls.
Well, I think you might properly make an argument for music that was specifically written for a concert hall. I think there might always be a festival occasion about going to Bayreuth. I've never been there. But I can well imagine that Wagner buffs, if there are such a couple of hundred years from now, may still make pilgrimages to Bayreuth. I think you may find, indeed, that the Royal Festival Hall, to name but one, has become a kind of museum, and that you go there to watch a nice stuffed Strauss tone poem.
No, I go there to listen to Richard Wagner Bennett's latest symphony, or to hear some Stravinsky or Berlioz or whatever.
You do now, indeed, but I mean, let's say 20, 30 years from now, I'm sure that you will go there as a thinking member of the laity. You will go there to view museum pieces.
Yes, but I happen to enjoy going to concerts. I like being part of a group of people. I like the excitement of a concert, the atmosphere.
I think this is
people
frightening.
play
I think it's a terrible admission about yourself that you do. This feeling of wanting to get with the herd instinct, you know.
That's not the herd instinct. I just think that it's fun, pleasurable to go and hear a piece of music played.
You're not going to tell me, surely, that you concentrate as well, that you listen as acutely in a concert hall as you can sitting at home quiet, or possibly with the family about, but in any case, no major disturbances. You're not going to tell me that you concentrate.
I have a score on my lap. I do, of course.
Well, I know that you Europeans do sit there occasionally with scores. We don't here. We turn out the light. You know, we make it even more dramatic and perfumery. But I simply cannot feel that any good can come of this cultivation of the herd in music listening. I think what we're getting through to now, because of recording, is a super subjective state. You know, we talk a lot about this question of individuality and what it means in the listening process, whether in fact there is such a thing as a listener who can form judgments that are uniquely his own. I don't think this was possible while concerts existed and while people sat there with some degree of the perspiration of 2,999 others penetrating their nostrils. I think it is indeed possible now that that we have home listening developed to a remarkable degree and on the verge of many greater breakthroughs.
There are many people who will assure you that recording is essentially a dishonest activity. They've decided that since recordings are composites and the artist can repeat a work or section of a work indefinitely until he gets satisfactory results, that they represent no true measure of his ability. This argument is raised so often nowadays that I think it would be worthwhile to examine it in some detail. I can only give you statistics based on my own recording experience, and I won't pretend to speak for any other musicians in this matter, because one finds such divergent attitudes toward this whole question in 2 or 3 or more diametrically opposed interpretations. And if such is the case, it seems to me important not to opt for one of the interpretations only, but if time permits, to record all of them, then to live with them on a test tape for some weeks or months, and to defer the decision as to which, if any, are satisfactory, until such time as one of them becomes incontestably more convincing than its companions. It's much as though one were to record the role of Hamlet, in many takes and each time with a different emphasis, perhaps first with an existential emphasis, to be or not to be. Then again with a Freudian emphasis, the bedchamber scene with Hamlet's mother would be the centerpiece of that one. Then again as a swashbuckling action drama with the swordplay of the last act, the inevitable outcome. And only after all of these Hamlets were recorded would one begin the process of assimilation. Now, what I'm suggesting is a philosophy of recording which runs counter to all the prevailing concepts of that elusive thing called artistic integrity. Because, of course, people who go to the theater expect to see Olivier's Hamlet, or Schofield's Hamlet, or Peter O'Toole's Hamlet, and going on to a concert they anticipate Klemperer's Beethoven, or Schmidt-Isserstedt's Beethoven, or Sawallich's Beethoven. And they become very upset if you challenge the notion that for each man there lies but one true road to Hamlet, or to Beethoven. Now, it may be perhaps that in live concerts, or in live theater, the one-way tradition is a necessary limitation. The economics of theater and concert management virtually rule out any possibility that Peter O'Toole could make Hamlet behave like Albert Camus one night and like Errol Flynn the next. The cost just to reorient the cast would be astronomical. Similarly, if Otto Klemperer were to give up his stolid, rather humorless Beethoven beat and launch into a free skating exhibition a la Leonard Bernstein, the members of the new Philharmonia Orchestra would find the whole thing a considerable inconvenience and might even have to look up from their music stands on occasion. I think the point is that in recording Beethoven, or in filming Hamlet, one is not held captive by the same restrictions, and sensibly one should not act as though one were. To harbor nostalgia for a medium is one thing, but to carry its limitations into a new medium is quite another. I firmly believe that recording is an autonomous medium and can profit one only if treated as such. When, 11 years ago, I recorded Bach's Goldberg Variations, I bypassed the theme, the very simple area upon which the variations are constructed, left it for recording until all the other variations had been satisfactorily put down on tape. I then turned to that ingenious little saraband and found that it took me 20 takes in order to locate a character for it which would be sufficiently neutral so as not to prejudge the depth of involvement that comes later in the work. It was a question of utilizing the first 20 takes to erase all superfluous expression from my reading of it, and there's nothing more difficult to do. The natural instinct of the performer is to add, not to subtract. In any case, the theme, as represented in my recording of the Goldberg Variations, is take 21. Now, it's quite possible that had I played the 30 variations differently, take one of the theme, or indeed any earlier take of it would have done as well. Because what we're dealing with here is the attempt to make a part fit the whole, to create a first page that will match the other 50 pages. And to anyone indoctrinated with concert procedures, not only will 21 takes of a simple air seem an outrageous indulgence, but more shocking still will be the cavalier dissection of the work, treating it bit by bit and out of sequence. Because, of course, if you give a concert and play a long work like the Goldberg Variations, not only must you resign yourself to the notion that no take two can come to the rescue, but you must also be prepared to accept the consequences of what you do from first note to last. If, for instance, through lack of concentration or tension, or through being distracted by the lady with the guitar and the jangling bracelet in the gallery, the theme emerges as an unwieldy, over-decorated, sentimentalized, rubato-filled air, one is stuck with it, and with its ramifications, and logically must impose its consequences upon the remainder of the work. In many ways, modern recording techniques are akin to those of the film medium. As in film, multiple takes are the rule, not the exception. The quest for a certain kind of technical perfection may at times override other considerations. As in film, the work can be viewed out of sequence. The finale, for instance, can be done first, and through its vitality, or lack of it, counsel modifications in the interpretation of the preceding movements. Again, as in film, one can usually put some distance between the actual making of the recording and the time when one must sit down, reflect upon the results, and edit them into a unified whole. Just as a film director will gain a measure of objectivity by sorting out the previous day's rushes, the recording artist and his producer are not bound to make final decisions during the taping session. And in my view, it's impossible to exaggerate the psychological importance of this afterthought control. For in recording, as in working with film, the producer's activity is of vital importance. Sometimes he has the difficult task of diplomatically persuading a performer to eliminate from contention a take which, in respect of performance, is a credit to him, but which strictly on its merits as a recording leaves something to be desired. One cannot, for instance, simply match and splice together two takes of adjacent segments of a movement, even though both may be admirably executed. An infinite number of technical considerations must be weighed into the bargain. Are the takes recorded at a uniform dynamic level? Are they played at a uniform dynamic level and at a consistent tempo? Is there a preponderance of pedal sonority in one take but not the other at the point where the splice must be made? Nothing will expose splices more cruelly than the sudden erasure of pedal overhang. In all such decisions, the producer's word is law. He must be allowed a veto. But there are other subtler ways in which he can influence the end result as well. In 1962, when I began to record the 48 preludes and fugues from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavichord, the producer assigned to the series was a young Englishman named Paul Myers, an indefatigable enthusiast of Baroque music. In an early session, we had worked through to the Prelude number 8, the rather celebrated one in E-flat minor. It's a piece that, in my day at least, most every student tried out at graduate recitals, but which, as a token of nonconformity, I had never learned to play. Consequently, I arrived at the studio with no very set notion about how it should go, which is quite a good way to arrive as long as you're prepared to learn on company time. Nevertheless, I wanted to find a character for it which would affirm its saraband-like simplicity while disassociating it from those doleful legato performances in which I'd so often heard it represented as one of the lesser Chopin nocturnes. Take one was made, and it went along fairly well. "Not bad," said Mr. Myers over the intercom. "I have the feeling you're trying to give it a guitar-like plucking." I confessed that I was. "In that case," said Mr. Myers, "it's still much too legato. Why don't you try to sustain the guitar effect throughout?" For a moment, I thought of all those zealous pedagogues and earnest students for whom the piano means legato playing, Bach means sobriety, and the Prelude in E-flat minor means no fun at all. Well, the result was Prelude in E-flat minor, take 2, which is the performance you hear on this recording, and my own favorite among all the bits of Bach that we've recorded these last 10 years. Needless to say, it was greeted with almost unanimous critical condemnation, and the following Christmas I presented Mr. Myers, since after all the whole thing was his idea, with a scrapbook stuffed with the most disparaging reviews on record.
one gains ideas from actually trying things that one can't quite try at home, one can't quite try under concert circumstances. You don't dare experiment to that degree in a concert, and at home you don't quite have the tension of the moment to make it necessary and feasible to experiment that widely.
There are lots of critics and concert goers I think would attach a kind of moral disapproval to that kind of behavior. It's not quite honest, perhaps.
Yeah, they feel that there's a certain amount of cheating involved. And of course there is, because, as you know, a recording very often consists of a collection of tape fragments that are quite carefully spliced together. A, to eliminate inaccuracies, finger fault of one kind or another. Mm-hmm. B, and much more important, to create a homogeneous entity out of that particular composition. We've put out a lot of music that consists of take one from start to finish. A lot of the Bach preludes and fugues, which are rather short pieces and hence no great achievement is involved, are take ones with no splices of any kind.
Or a complete take three.
Or a complete take three, yes.
With no splicing.
Yes. On the other hand, some of the very best things we've done, and I'm thinking particularly of one fugue, the A minor from the first volume of the Wohltemperate Klavier, consisted of two extraordinary takes which were absolutely different in character and which miraculously matched each other, paced each other in tempi. And this is very unusual.
Why don't you illustrate what you're speaking of?
Right. Well, we played the A minor fugue about a year and a half ago at a session in two completely different ways, and in the first fashion, this was the way in which we phrased the subject. That became what we called take 6. Then we had a take 8. Take 7 was rather a letdown, as I recall. And take 8 sounded something like this. And in take 8, as you can see, there was a very Teutonic emphasis. It was very pompous, it was very grand, it was a little bit turgid, a little bit boring, and we felt that we couldn't go on indefinitely being that pompous about a phrase, a motivic idea that on the whole was rather light-hearted, even though its texture was quite thick. At the same time, we couldn't be quite as skittish as Take 6 was either. So about a month later, sitting in the playback booth, we discovered that both these takes, Take 6 and Take 8, were accomplished in exactly the same amount of time. I don't remember what the minute and second hand read at the moment, but perhaps 3 minutes 20 for one, 3 minutes 22 for the other. Very close in any event. Yeah. And we then found that it was possible, in effect, to make a constant shift of gear between Take 6 and Take 8. To use Take 8, to use this pompous, rather turgid, rather Teutonic version of the theme and of its corresponding answers, for all of the basic expository passages, and for all the episodic and fragmentary ones, to use Take 6, to lighten the texture as if one were shifting to the upper register of a harpsichord or whatever. And it made one of the very best fugues that we've put out, I think.
So you build your interpretation with the razor blade and the engineer.
Indeed, and we built it after the fact. We had no idea on the day of the session that it would turn out that way. We couldn't possibly have guessed at it, and I don't think that under any pressured circumstance, under concert condition, for instance, one could ever have arrived at something quite that, if I may use the word in quite the wrong place, inspired version. I think that it's very much easier to do that when you're dealing with Baroque music, let's say, which has no written-in tempo indications, and where composers like Bach provided few and far between dynamic indications, for that matter. One can obviously improvise a great deal within the framework that you're given. It's rather less easy to do it, and one is inclined to bring down critical wrath upon one's head if one does do it in romantic music, where things are written out to a fair nicety.
I had a fascinating experience a couple of weeks ago. I sat in a studio in New York and took a couple of Bach fugues, the E major fugue from the second volume of the 48 and the F sharp minor fugue from the same book, and also the B flat minor from that book. And these are fugues that I've played all my life. I'm very familiar with them. I can't quite say I could do them in my sleep, but I think almost that, because they were favorite pieces when I was a teenager. And I had almost the performing experience of a lifetime, I would say. I put on a set of earphones and had fed to me my own click track, which in this case consisted of simply saying 4, 3, 2, 1, and the constituted the beat. Whereupon I went back to the bass voice and started playing the bass voice along with my controlled performance, hearing only what I had just done and hearing really a muffled version, as one must necessarily do with earphones, of what I was in fact doing. And having put down the bass voice in this fashion, we did the tenor and the alto and the soprano and so on. And the extraordinary thing was that having known these pieces 20 years, perhaps, 20 years conservatively indeed, I saw them and heard them afresh in the most extraordinary way. I had never realized things about the inner voice aspects of those fugues, which are manifestly clear. They're simply there to be apprehended by anyone who takes a close look at that score. And I'm sure that if you took a student, or indeed anyone who was at all interested in music and suspicious of the contrapuntal experience, because a lot of people are, if you took him into a studio and had him do precisely that, let him listen to one voice at a time, which I really think is the ideal way to understand music in any case. It leads to other questions as to whether one can be content with that on a larger scale of experience music. I'm sure that it would change his whole notion of what Bach was, what the Baroque represented, what that whole incredibly involved experiment of Baroque counterpoint really meant.
Do you foresee at some point presenting that experience to the public in the form of a recording?
I would like to try. It isn't quite feasible yet. It isn't feasible in my own case until I learn to play duets and trios and quartets with myself successfully, which I certainly did not do on this occasion. It was a disaster as an ensemble performance. But I would love to see performances of that kind presented in four-corner stereo, a speaker in each corner of the room. It would be a totally unreal performance. One would not, in any sense, be confronted with the spectacle or the sense or the awareness of somebody up there on that podium, on that platform, playing at you. You would be in the center of the problem, so to speak. And I think that's really what, the listener should try to do, and the way in which performance experiment with Bach must continue and must try to bring the listener into the center of the problem.
When you successfully solve that problem for yourself, I can see a hotel cocktail lounge advertising featuring the Glenn Gould Quartet.
Presumably there could be a generation growing up that has learned to correlate a contrapuntal experience with a certain kind of visual image. What would it be? Something very inner and post-expressionist, sort of Rorschach blot?
I think there are probably as many possible pictorial associations with, let's say, a Bach fugue, which does not contain anything that could possibly be remotely associated with the visual, other than by a kind of literal Mickey Mouse effect. When the notes go up, you think of clouds, and when the notes go down, you think of grottos. But leaving aside that kind of literalness, it would probably take someone who had a very strong visual sense already. Let's say a filmmaker like Norman McLaren might make direct visual associations with a Bach fugue that wouldn't occur to either of us.
Well, there is, I suppose, an animation-like aspect to Bach as regards his performance anyway, because one can certainly think of it as existing at an infinite number of tempi, as being taken frame by frame, separate, fragmented, and it valued for that individual frame.
It feels that way looking at it from the point of view of its composition. It feels rather like having to put the piece together note by note by note, one at a time, to get each one exactly right and exactly in its right place, just the way you would put together animation cells to be able to ultimately simulate emotion, which by the time it arrives in the form of emotion projected as a film has to seem completely natural and flowing and appropriate to the character that you're trying to portray. And yet, in its technical execution, it has only been put together very, very slowly, piece by piece, painstakingly. And none of that must ever be apparent.
Do you think that film observation, I mean, the whole cult of film, which is the new great super art, the art that Wagner thought he was inventing, do you think that filmmaking is going to influence the way in which we listen to music?
Yeah, it may very well be that what film will ultimately do is to change both our ears and our eyes. I mean, the ability of the eye to lead the ear and the ear to lead the eye is something that film is exploring more and more by offsetting the track, by leading your ear into the next scene before you have visually left the preceding scene, or doing the reverse, introducing visually something that is about to happen while the track continues to hold on something that you have just been leaving. And in that sense, it's a construction which is not all that unrelated to the principles of counterpoint.
I have a feeling that it's changed our sense of distance that sound represents. And I know that since film became more and more important to me in the last decade or so, I've begun to think of music dimensionally in a way that just hadn't occurred before. See, I have a feeling that what we're going to do eventually is to forget about this funny notion that we've carried over into the recording of music strictly as a legacy, and a very poor one, of the concert hall. And that is that we should sit the listener down in front of his stereo speakers and confront him box-like with an experience. I don't think that we're supposed to confront him with anything at all, and I think that one way in which that can be broken through is to think in terms of multiple perspectives which represent and which choreograph and which set forth the work as clearly and as analytically as we can. I mean, precisely in the way in which a film track would have multiple perspectives applied to it, you know, to represent the kind of situation it was, the horse leaning over and kissing the girl from the farm next door, that kind of scene, as against the intimate chat by the Bonanza fireplace, that kind of scene. You know, nobody's ever thought of doing this to music, except in relation to one symphony as against the next symphony, maybe. In that way, you could convey precisely what the emotion of that piece, just as an animator could convey it to you, was all about, you know. You wouldn't violate the music. There would be no sense of violating the music. What you would violate is the ridiculous, too long-held perspective of the concert hall, which has kept us going and in business for a long time. But
what on the concert platform do you recall as among the most frantic, instant processes of Bach decision-making?
The ones that I couldn't remember.
Glenn Gould, the well-tempered polymath, featured the late Glenn Gould in conversation with composer-critic Curtis Davis, former CBC radio music producer James Kent, Professor Hans Eichner, head of the German department, University of Toronto, BBC music commentator and critic Humphrey Burton, and John McClure, head of the classical music division of CBS Records. The excerpts were taken from 10 Minutes with Glenn Gould, The Well-Tempered Listener, Final Takes from The Art of Glenn Gould, the Hans Eichner interview from MusicScope, The Psychology of Improvisation from the Ideas series, Bach and His Keys from Thursday Music, and To Every Man His Own Bach and the Gould-Burton debate from CBC and BBC television specials. We gratefully acknowledge the cooperation of both the radio and television archives of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the Glenn Gould Estate, and producer Vincent Tovell of TV Arts and Sciences in the preparation of this program. Glenn Gould, the Well-Tempered Polymath, was edited, written, and produced by Warren Wilson. Technical operations were by David Quinney. Production assistant, Laura Singleton. Executive producer, Ann Gibson. I'm Ken Winters.